Spoiled sister goes ballistic after I refuse $8,000 designer wedding dress. Growing up, my sister and I lived vastly different lives. With an 11-year age gap, it often felt like we belonged to separate generations. By the time she was born, I was already old enough to babysit her, and in many ways, I became her third parent. My parents, both dentists with thriving careers, were overwhelmed when they unexpectedly had another child in their 30s. They had poured their energy into raising me, ensuring I had access to good schools and extracurricular activities. By the time my sister arrived, their approach had shifted. They indulged her at every turn, perhaps out of guilt for being older parents or simply because they could afford to. From an early age, my sister thrived on attention. She was the toddler everyone adored at family gatherings, the one in frilly dresses who always managed to steal the show. Meanwhile, I was the responsible one, the good child, who got straight A's and never caused trouble. I didn't resent her for it, though. In fact, I often joined in spoiling her, sneaking her candy when mom said no and helping her get out of trouble when she broke something expensive. But as the years passed, this dynamic bred entitlement in her. She grew used to being the center of attention and expected everyone to cater to her whims. While I worked hard to become a dentist, following in my parents' footsteps, my sister flitted from one dream to another. At 18, she declared she wanted to be an actress. I supported her wholeheartedly, even convincing our skeptical parents to let her attend a film school that cost more than some Ivy League colleges. Her reasoning? If I'm going to be a star, I need the best training. Her enthusiasm for acting was short-lived. Within 2 years, she dropped out, claiming the industry was too fake for her authentic self. Next, she dabbled in fashion, enrolling in a prestigious design program. This, too, ended abruptly when she decided the professors didn't appreciate her unique vision. By then, our parents were exasperated, but I remained her biggest cheerleader. I funded her first big trip to Paris, hoping it might inspire her to find her calling. Instead, she came back with designer handbags and no career prospects. When my sister announced her engagement, I was genuinely happy for her. Despite her chaotic past, she seemed to have found stability with her fiancé, an engineer with a good job and a down-to-earth personality. She called me the night he proposed, gushing about the diamond ring and their future plans. "You have to help me plan everything," she exclaimed. "It's going to be the wedding of the century." I threw myself into helping her, spending weekends visiting bridal boutiques, scouting venues, and meeting caterers. She was insistent on every detail being perfect. Nothing less than a fairy tale would suffice. I offered to pay for her wedding dress as a gesture of love, assuming she'd pick something elegant but reasonable. My friend owned a bridal boutique and had even promised us a discount. But my sister had other plans. One afternoon, she presented me with a glossy magazine, pointing to a gown that cost a staggering $8,000. "This is the one," she declared, her eyes gleaming. I hesitated. "That's a bit steep," I said carefully. "Don't forget, I'm also planning a surprise for you after the wedding." "What kind of surprise?" she asked, narrowing her eyes suspiciously. I smiled. "You'll find out later. But trust me, you'll love it." She shrugged, unimpressed. "Well, the dress is non-negotiable. It's my dream dress, and you can afford it." Her words stung. I had always been generous with her, but this felt different. She wasn't asking. She was demanding. "I can't spend that much on a dress you'll wear once," I replied firmly. "How about we find something similar at my friend's boutique? She can even customize it for you." My sister's face darkened. "It's not the same. I want the label. If you really cared about me, you'd do this." "I do care," I said gently. "That's why I'm planning something even bigger for you." But she wasn't listening. She stormed off, leaving me standing alone in the boutique. Later that evening, she called me a miser and made cruel comments about my single status. "You don't even have a family to spend money on," she sneered. "Why are you hoarding it like some bitter old spinster?" The fight over the dress escalated quickly. She stopped answering my calls and ignored my texts. Weeks turned into months, and I began to hear whispers from relatives about how I was being difficult and unsupportive. It hurt more than I wanted to admit, especially since I'd already been planning a surprise Europe honeymoon for her and her fiancé. I had spent months mapping out the itinerary, booking luxury hotels, and arranging private tours. but now it felt like a waste. As the wedding day approached, I realized I hadn't received an invitation. My parents assured me it was an oversight, but deep down I knew better. She didn't want me there. On the morning of her wedding, I was jolted awake by the sound of my doorbell. Bleary-eyed, I looked at the clock. 6 a.m. To my surprise, it was my sister, standing on my doorstep in her robe and looking desperate. "I need to talk to you," she said through the intercom. I hesitated. After months of silence, what could she possibly want now? I called her phone instead of opening the door. "Why are you here?" I asked coldly. "I made a mistake," she said sweetly. "I want you to come to the wedding. Please." I could hear the insincerity in her voice. "Did Mom tell you about the gift I was planning?" I asked bluntly. She hesitated before admitting it. "Yes. And it made me realize how much you care." I laughed bitterly. "So, if Mom hadn't told you, I'd still be uninvited?" She didn't answer, which was answer enough. I told her to leave and hung up the phone. Moments later, she kicked my door and screamed insults before driving away. It was a wake-up call. I needed to stop trying to win her approval. Fueled by a mix of anger and liberation, I decided to use the honeymoon plans for myself. I invited a close friend to join me, and together, we embarked on the European adventure I had meticulously planned. I posted photos on social media, knowing they'd reach her through mutual friends. The responses were immediate. My sister was reportedly inconsolable, crying to our parents about how I had stolen her dream. When my mother called to scold me, I calmly reminded her of how I had been treated. "I'm done being the scapegoat," I said firmly. "If she's upset, that's on her." The trip turned out to be a blessing in disguise. For the first time in years, I felt free from family drama, free from toxic relationships, and free to put myself first. By the time I returned home, I had made a decision. I wouldn't let my family's dysfunction define me anymore. My parents and sister could continue their cycle of enabling and entitlement, but I was done being part of it. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. As my flight landed in Paris, I felt an unfamiliar sensation, an almost giddy mix of freedom and exhilaration. This wasn't just a vacation, it was a reclamation of my life. My friend Ethan, who had jumped at the chance to join me on this adventure, could see the spark in my eyes. "First time in Europe?" he asked with a grin. "No," I replied, smiling. "But it's the first time I'm here for myself." Ethan nodded knowingly. He had been my sounding board through the tumultuous weeks leading up to this trip. His encouragement had been the final push I needed to reclaim my power and leave the toxicity of my family behind, at least for now. Our first stop was the Eiffel Tower, cliché but breathtaking. As we stood in line for the elevator, Ethan teased, "So, is this where you post your revenge selfie?" I laughed, genuinely this time. "I don't think it's revenge. It's more like a declaration." We took dozens of pictures, me laughing, Ethan making goofy faces, and us both holding up croissants like trophies. I posted them with captions that had just the right touch of sarcasm, like living my best spinster life. It was cathartic, not just because I knew my sister would see them, but because I was finally reclaiming my narrative. The streets of Paris were magical, but they also gave me space to reflect. For years, I had bent over backward to please my sister and my family, believing it was my duty. Yet here I was, thousands of miles away, feeling lighter with every step. It was as though the weight of their expectations had stayed behind. It didn't take long for the fallout to reach me. On our second day in Paris, I woke up to several missed calls from my mother. When I finally answered, her voice was tight with frustration. "Your sister saw your posts," she began, skipping any pleasantries. "She's devastated." "Devastated about what?" I asked, feigning innocence. "I thought she didn't care about me anymore." "Don't be cruel," my mother snapped. "You know she's sensitive." "Sensitive?" I repeated, my voice rising. "She called me names, ignored me for months, and didn't invite me to her wedding. But I'm the cruel one?" "She's your sister," my mother insisted. "You should try to understand her." I hung up before I said something I'd regret. Ethan, who had overheard my side of the conversation, handed me a pain-o chocolate and said, "Eat. Then we'll walk it off." As we strolled along the Seine, Ethan asked, "Do you think they'll ever change?" I shook my head. "No." And I think that's the hardest part, accepting that they won't. Our next stop was Italy, where we spent a week indulging in the best food and wine I'd ever tasted. In Florence, we marveled at the art in the Uffizi Gallery, and in Venice, we floated along the canals, soaking in the romance of the city. For the first time in years, I felt alive, not just existing, but truly living. One night, over a bottle of Chianti, Ethan and I talked about the trip and what it represented. "You know," he said, "this could have been her honeymoon." "Yeah," I replied, swirling my wine. "But she wouldn't have appreciated it. She never appreciates anything unless it's exactly her way." "Do you think you'll ever talk to her again?" Ethan asked. I thought about it. I don't know. Maybe if she ever truly apologizes. But I won't hold my breath. Ethan raised his glass. "To new beginnings, then." "To new beginnings," I echoed, clinking my glass against his. Midway through the trip, I received a message from my cousin Rachel, one of the few family members I still trusted. It was a screenshot of a Facebook post my sister had made. In it, she accused me of being jealous and vindictive, claiming I had stolen her dream honeymoon out of spite. The comments were a mix of support and criticism, with some relatives chiming in to scold me while others defended my actions. "Do you want me to respond?" Rachel asked in her text. "No," I replied. "Let her dig her own grave." But the post lingered in my mind. It wasn't the lies that bothered me. It was the realization that my sister would never take accountability for her actions. She would always twist the narrative to make herself the victim. I showed the post to Ethan later that night. He read it and shook his head. "She's projecting. You're living your best life, and she can't handle it." As our trip continued, I found myself growing closer to Ethan. We had been friends for years, but there was something about this shared experience that deepened our bond. One evening in Santorini, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan turned to me and said, "You know, I've always admired you." "Admired me?" I repeated, laughing. "For what?" "For being strong," he said, "even when you didn't realize it." His words caught me off guard. For so long, I had seen myself as the dutiful daughter, the self-sacrificing sister, the one who always put others first. But here, in this moment, I felt seen for who I truly was, a woman learning to reclaim her power. When I returned home after 6 weeks, I was a different person. The trip had given me a new perspective, not just on my family, but on myself. I was no longer willing to tolerate their toxicity, and I made that clear when my parents tried to guilt-trip me about my sister's latest tantrum. "I'm done," I told them firmly. "If she wants a relationship, she knows where to find me. But I'm not chasing her anymore." My mother sighed, but my father looked genuinely shocked. For years, they had taken my support for granted, assuming I'd always be there to pick up the pieces. But not anymore. Ethan and I started dating shortly after we returned from Europe. It felt natural, as though our friendship had been leading to this all along. He was my rock, my confidant, and the first person who made me feel truly valued. As for my sister, she continued her pattern of drama and manipulation. But I no longer felt tethered to her chaos. I had built a life for myself, one filled with love, adventure, and self-respect. Looking back, I realized that the trip wasn't just about reclaiming my life from my sister's shadow. It was about discovering who I was outside of my family's expectations. And for that, I would always be grateful.